9 months ago, Emily Carter disappeared from her isolated cabin in the dense forests of Oregon, leaving behind nothing but silence and unanswered questions. The 31-year-old graphic designer had moved from bustling Portland to the remote wilderness, seeking solace after a painful divorce that had shattered her world. Her disappearance plunged her family into unimaginable grief and left the small mountain community of Cedar Ridge bewildered. The police explored every possibility: wild animal attack, accident, voluntary disappearance, but found no concrete evidence. This failure sparked outrage among her loved ones, who never lost hope that the truth would emerge. Before we continue, please subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps the channel bring you more stories like this one. Emily's decision to move to the cabin wasn't impulsive. After 15 years of marriage, discovering her husband David's affair with his secretary had left her emotionally devastated. The betrayal came at the worst possible time, just weeks after she had suffered her second miscarriage, a loss that had already strained their relationship beyond repair. Her sister Sarah described her as a broken soul seeking healing in nature's embrace. The cabin, inherited from their grandmother Rose, sat on 20 acres of dense woodland, miles from the nearest neighbor. Emily saw it as her sanctuary, a place to rebuild herself away from painful memories and the judgmental whispers of mutual friends who had chosen sides in the divorce. The property itself held deep significance for the Carter family. Their grandmother had purchased the land in 1967, using money saved from decades of teaching in rural Oregon schools. Rose Carter had been a strong, independent woman who believed in the healing power of nature. She had built the cabin with her own hands, aided by local craftsmen who respected her determination. Emily had spent countless childhood summers there, learning to paint watercolors of wildflowers, helping tend the vegetable garden, and listening to her grandmother's stories about the early settlers who had carved lives from the unforgiving wilderness. Emily's ex-husband, David, had never understood her connection to the cabin. During their marriage, he had pressured her to sell the property, arguing that it was too isolated and impractical to maintain. He preferred luxury hotels and cruise ships for vacations, dismissing Emily's love of hiking and camping as childish hobbies. Looking back, Sarah realized this fundamental difference in values had been a warning sign about their incompatibility that the family had chosen to ignore. The young woman had always been methodical, almost obsessive about documentation. Throughout her marriage, she kept detailed journals, photographed every vacation, every milestone, every moment she deemed worth remembering. This habit had intensified after her miscarriages, as if she feared losing precious memories, the same way she had lost her unborn children. When she moved to Oregon, this compulsion followed her. She purchased a professional-grade GoPro camera shortly after settling into the cabin, determined to record her journey of self-discovery and healing. She said she wanted to document her healing process, Sarah recalled, tears streaming down her face during a later interview. She believed filming herself would help her process the pain, like a visual diary that she could look back on to measure her progress. Emily was always trying to find meaning in her suffering, always looking for ways to transform her pain into something constructive. The camera became Emily's constant companion, witness to her daily routines, her struggles with loneliness, and her gradual emergence from the darkness of depression. Emily's routine was simple yet purposeful. Each morning she would set up the camera in her kitchen and record herself preparing breakfast, usually oatmeal with berries she had gathered from the surrounding woods. She would talk about her plans for the day, sharing her thoughts about starting over, describing her dreams of becoming a freelance artist, specializing in nature photography and watercolor paintings. Her recordings showed a woman slowly emerging from depression's shadow, finding joy in simple pleasures like morning coffee, sunset walks, and the satisfaction of completing small repair projects around the cabin. The early videos revealed someone genuinely hopeful about her future. Emily spoke enthusiastically about her plans to convert the cabin's unused loft into an art studio, about learning to identify different bird species that visited her property, about the novel she was planning to write, based on her grandmother's stories about the early days of Cedar Ridge. She documented her progress learning to use a chainsaw, her attempts at organic gardening, and her growing confidence in navigating the wilderness surrounding her new home. But as weeks passed, subtle changes crept into Emily's demeanor that would later prove prophetic. She began glancing toward the windows more frequently, pausing mid-sentence as if hearing something others couldn't perceive. Her cheerful morning greetings grew shorter, more distracted. By the 7th week, she was checking the locks multiple times during each recording, testing the windows, and speaking in lowered tones, even though she was supposedly alone. "I keep feeling like someone's watching," she whispered to the camera one evening, her voice barely audible above the wind howling through the towering Douglas fir trees. The transformation in Emily's behavior was gradual, but unmistakable to anyone who watched her recordings chronologically. Her paintings, visible in the background of many videos, evolved from bright landscapes celebrating the beauty of her surroundings to darker, more abstract works featuring shadowy figures and ominous forest scenes. Her sleep patterns deteriorated, evidenced by the dark circles under her eyes and her frequent mentions of insomnia. She began keeping a baseball bat beside her bed, explaining to the camera that she was worried about bears, though black bears in the region were typically timid and avoided human contact. The final recording, dated 3 days before Emily was reported missing, showed her in a state of barely controlled panic. She sat closer to the camera than usual, her hands visibly trembling as she tried to maintain her composure. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept properly in days. Her hair was unwashed and pulled back in a messy ponytail, a stark contrast to the carefully groomed woman who had started documenting her journey months earlier. "If something happens to me," she said, her voice urgent and frightened, "look under the floorboards near the fireplace. I've been hiding the camera there because I don't think I'm alone out here anymore. Someone has been in my house. I can smell cigarette smoke in the mornings, but I don't smoke." Things are moved just slightly. My coffee mug turned a different direction, books rearranged on the shelf, my paintings touched with fingers that aren't mine. He wants me to know he's been here. The recording continued for several more minutes, as Emily described her growing paranoia and fear. She spoke about calling the sheriff's department multiple times, only to be dismissed as an anxious city woman adjusting to rural life. She described finding footprints in the mud around her cabin after rainstorms, always in places where someone would have to deliberately walk to leave them. Most disturbing was her description of finding her spare key moved from its hiding place under a fake rock by the front porch, then returned to its original location the next day. "I know how this sounds," Emily whispered to the camera, glancing frequently toward the windows. "I know I sound paranoid, maybe even crazy. But I know when someone has been in my space. I can feel it. There's a presence here that doesn't belong, someone who knows my routines, who watches me, who wants me to be afraid." The recording abruptly ended when the distinct sound of footsteps on the cabin's front porch caused Emily to freeze in terror, her eyes wide with fear as she reached to turn off the camera. When Emily failed to respond to calls and texts for 3 consecutive days, her sister Sarah made the 4-hour drive from Portland to the cabin with a growing sense of dread. The sisters had maintained daily contact since Emily's move to the mountains, usually sharing morning coffee virtually through video calls while Emily prepared for her day. The sudden silence was completely out of character for someone who had been documenting every aspect of her new life. Sarah's journey to Cedar Ridge was fraught with anxiety and traffic delays caused by construction on Highway 126. She tried calling Emily's cell phone repeatedly during the drive, each unanswered ring increasing her panic. She also attempted to contact neighbors, only to remember that the cabin's isolation meant there were no nearby residents to check on Emily. The closest house was over 2 miles away, belonging to an elderly couple who barely knew Emily existed. What Sarah found at the cabin would haunt her forever. The front door stood slightly ajar, creaking in the mountain breeze like something from a horror movie. Emily's car, a silver Honda Accord she had purchased after the divorce, remained parked exactly where Sarah expected to find it. The sight of the vehicle provided both relief and increased concern. Relief that Emily hadn't been in a car accident, but growing fear about why she would have left the door open if she had gone for a walk in the surrounding wilderness. Inside, everything appeared deceptively normal at first glance. Emily's coffee mug sat on the counter next to the kitchen sink, still containing the remnants of what looked like her usual morning blend. Her bed was neatly made with the colorful quilt their grandmother had sewn decades earlier. Painting supplies were arranged on the kitchen table in Emily's characteristically organized fashion, brushes cleaned and sorted by size, paints arranged in color order, a palette covered with dried remnants of her most recent work. But as Sarah moved through the cabin more carefully, disturbing details began to emerge. Emily's purse sat on the counter, but it had been searched. contents removed and replaced haphazardly, unlike Emily's usual meticulous organization. Her laptop was closed, but still warm, suggesting someone had been using it recently. Most puzzling was the absence of Emily's beloved GoPro camera, which Sarah knew her sister used religiously to document her daily activities. Sarah immediately contacted the Jackson County Sheriff's Department from Emily's landline, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. The dispatcher who answered seemed concerned, but not alarmed. Missing adults were common in the wilderness, often returning after extended hikes or camping trips. Sarah struggled to convey the urgency of the situation, trying to explain that Emily would never simply disappear without notification, especially given her current emotional vulnerability. Deputy Marcus Thompson arrived within an hour, his patrol vehicle kicking up dust as it navigated the rough gravel road leading to Emily's property. Thompson was a 20-year veteran of the department, known for his thorough approach to investigations and his compassionate handling of family members during crisis situations. His initial assessment seemed professional and competent, though later events would cast his every action in a sinister light. Thompson's examination of the scene was methodical and appeared thorough. He noted the absence of signs of struggle or forced entry, the presence of Emily's car and personal belongings, and the general orderliness of the cabin's interior. He asked detailed questions about Emily's mental state, her divorce proceedings, and any potential conflicts with former friends or colleagues. Sarah found his questions invasive, but assumed they were necessary for a proper investigation. "In my experience," Deputy Thompson later testified during official proceedings, "people don't just vanish without leaving some trace, but Emily Carter seemed to have simply disappeared into thin air." This statement, made with apparent sincerity, would later be recognized as a masterful piece of misdirection from someone who knew exactly what had happened to Emily. The official search began immediately, involving local volunteers, search and rescue teams specially trained in wilderness recovery, and cadaver dogs capable of detecting human remains even after significant time had passed. The initial search area covered a 5-mile radius around the cabin, encompassing steep ravines, dense forest, abandoned logging roads, and the creek system that fed into the larger Rogue River watershed. Search and rescue coordinator Janet Mills organized the volunteer effort with military precision. A retired Army sergeant who had moved to Oregon after her military service, Mills understood the challenges of locating a missing person in such rugged terrain. She divided the search area into grid sections, assigned teams to each area, and established communication protocols to ensure no section was overlooked or searched twice. The community of Cedar Ridge rallied around the Carter family with remarkable solidarity that spoke to the tight-knit nature of rural Oregon communities. Local business owner Margaret Flynn, who ran the town's only grocery store, organized daily search parties and coordinated meal deliveries for volunteers. The Cedar Ridge Community Center became an unofficial headquarters for search operations, with local residents donating coffee, sandwiches, maps, and GPS equipment. "Emily might have been new to our area," Margaret explained during a news interview, "but she was one of us. When someone goes missing in our mountains, we don't rest until we find them. That's just how we do things here." The sentiment was echoed by dozens of volunteers who had never met Emily but felt compelled to help search for her. As days turned into weeks, the initial optimism began to fade despite the tireless efforts of searchers. The search dogs lost Emily's scent about half a mile from the cabin, near Salmon Creek, where the spring snowmelt had swollen the waterway beyond its normal banks. This led investigators to theorize that Emily might have fallen into the water and been swept downstream, her body carried miles away by the powerful current. The creek theory seemed plausible to many investigators. The spring of Emily's disappearance had been particularly wet, with snowpack in the Cascade Mountains melting rapidly due to an unusual warm spell. Salmon Creek, normally a gentle stream that Emily could have easily crossed, had become a dangerous torrent, capable of sweeping away even experienced outdoors enthusiasts. Several searchers noted that the creek's banks were muddy and unstable, creating hazardous conditions for anyone unfamiliar with seasonal water patterns. Detective Lisa Rodriguez took over the case after 2 weeks of fruitless searching, bringing 15 years of experience in missing persons investigations to the effort. Rodriguez was known throughout the region for her methodical approach to cases and her ability to find overlooked evidence that other investigators had missed. Her reputation for never giving up on a case made her the logical choice to lead the investigation, When it became clear that Emily's disappearance was more complex than initially believed, Rodriguez immediately expanded the investigation beyond the theory of accidental drowning, recognizing that the physical evidence didn't fully support that conclusion. She ordered detailed interviews with Emily's ex-husband David, her Portland-based friends and colleagues, and anyone who had interacted with Emily during her months at the cabin. She also requested financial records, phone logs, and internet browsing history to build a comprehensive picture of Emily's final weeks. The interview with David Carter proved particularly challenging. Emily's ex-husband was initially defensive and hostile, apparently viewing the questioning as an accusation of wrongdoing. However, his alibi was ironclad. He'd been in Seattle on business during the time frame of Emily's disappearance, with hotel receipts, meeting schedules, restaurant charges, and multiple witness confirmations to support his whereabouts. Security cameras at his hotel showed him entering and leaving the building at times that made it impossible for him to have traveled to Oregon. 6 months after Emily's disappearance, the case had officially transitioned from an active investigation to a periodic review. Though Detective Rodriguez continued working leads in her spare time, the transition was devastating for the Carter family, particularly Sarah, who interpreted the change in status as law enforcement giving up on finding her sister. The emotional toll of months of uncertainty had transformed Sarah from a confident school counselor into someone barely able to function in daily life. Sarah had taken unpaid leave from her position at Lincoln Elementary School in Portland, where she had worked as a guidance counselor for 8 years. Her colleagues and supervisor had been supportive initially, understanding that family emergencies required immediate attention. However, as weeks turned into months, they began expressing concerns about her extended absence and her ability to return to the emotional demands of counseling children when she was clearly struggling with her own trauma. The physical effects of chronic stress were evident in Sarah's appearance and behavior. She had lost 15 pounds from her already slender frame, developing the gaunt, hollow-eyed look of someone who rarely slept or ate regular meals. Her dark hair, always neatly styled during her professional life, hung limp and unwashed. She had developed a nervous habit of checking her phone obsessively, hoping for news about Emily, while simultaneously dreading the call that might bring finality to her sister's story. "People kept telling me to accept that Emily was gone," Sarah recalled during a later interview, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Friends, family members, even my therapist suggested I needed to start the grieving process, to have a memorial service and begin moving forward with my life. But I knew my sister better than anyone. She wouldn't just walk away from her life, even after the divorce. She was finally starting to heal, to find herself again. Something happened to her, and I wasn't going to let the world forget Emily Carter." Detective Rodriguez's continued investigation was driven by professional instinct rather than official directive. Something about Emily's disappearance bothered her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Her 15 years of experience in missing persons cases had taught her to recognize patterns, to distinguish between voluntary disappearances, accidents, and potential crimes. Emily's case contained elements that didn't fit neatly into any category, creating a persistent sense that crucial evidence remained undiscovered. The detective's concerns centered on several inconsistencies that had emerged during the investigation. Emily's financial records showed no unusual transactions or withdrawals that might suggest planned flight. Her social media accounts remained inactive, unusual for someone who had been documenting her new life extensively. Most puzzling was the complete absence of her camera equipment, particularly the GoPro that multiple people confirmed she used daily. Rodriguez had interviewed Emily's Portland-based friends and colleagues, painting a picture of someone who was methodically rebuilding her life after divorce. Emily had been seeing a therapist, Dr. Amanda Chen, who described her patient as making steady progress in processing her trauma and developing healthy coping mechanisms. Dr. Chen's notes, released with appropriate legal permissions, showed no indication of suicidal ideation or desire to disappear voluntarily. During this period, Sarah made a discovery that would prove crucial to understanding Emily's final weeks. While going through her sister's belongings at the cabin, she found Emily's private YouTube channel, protected by passwords that Sarah eventually guessed using combinations of significant family dates and locations. The channel contained dozens of recordings Emily had uploaded automatically from her phone, providing a window into her daily life that was both intimate and increasingly disturbing. Watching the recordings was emotionally devastating for Sarah, but also revealing. She could observe the progression of fear in Emily's demeanor, the way her sister's confidence gradually eroded as something, or someone, began to terrorize her. The early videos showed Emily optimistic about her future, excited about her art projects, and genuinely happy for the first time since her divorce. But later recordings revealed a woman under tremendous psychological pressure, constantly looking over her shoulder and jumping at unexpected sounds. The family hired private investigator Robert Steinberg after growing frustrated with the official investigation's apparent lack of progress. Steinberg was a former FBI profiler who had established a successful private practice specializing in missing persons and cold cases. His reputation for solving cases that had stumped local law enforcement made him expensive, but Sarah was willing to exhaust her savings and Emily's inheritance to find answers. Steinberg's preliminary assessment challenged the official theory of accidental drowning from its very foundation. Emily Carter was an experienced outdoors woman, he noted in his initial report. She grew up camping and hiking with her father throughout Oregon and Washington. She understood wilderness safety, knew how to read weather patterns, and was familiar with seasonal creek conditions. The idea that she would venture too close to a dangerous waterway, especially given her documented paranoia in her final weeks, doesn't align with her personality profile or outdoor experience. The private investigator's background research revealed additional troubling details that had been overlooked or dismissed by the official investigation. Emily had made several calls to the sheriff's department in the weeks before her disappearance, reporting suspicious activity around her cabin. These calls had been logged but never thoroughly investigated, with deputies attributing Emily's reports to the paranoia of a city woman adjusting to rural isolation. The phone logs showed that Emily had called the department 5 times in her final 3 weeks. Her reports described vehicles driving slowly past her property at unusual hours, footprints in the mud around her home that didn't match her own boots, and the persistent feeling of being watched. Deputy Thompson, who had taken several of these calls, had noted in his reports that Emily seemed anxious and possibly delusional, but that no physical evidence supported her claims of harassment or stalking. Steinberg's investigation also uncovered Emily's attempts to reach out to other law enforcement agencies and community resources. She had contacted the Oregon State Police, the Forest Service, and even the FBI field office in Portland, trying to find someone who would take her concerns seriously. Each agency had referred her back to local law enforcement, creating a bureaucratic circle that left Emily increasingly isolated and desperate for help. The private investigator's analysis of the crime scene photos revealed details that had been missed or misinterpreted during the initial investigation. Emily's art supplies, while appearing organized, showed signs of having been rearranged by someone other than Emily herself. Her painting brushes were sorted by size rather than type, contrary to her usual organizational system. Her paint tubes were arranged in alphabetical order rather than the color spectrum organization she typically preferred. Most significantly, Steinberg noticed that several of Emily's recent paintings were missing from the cabin. Sarah confirmed that Emily had been working on a series of forest landscapes during her final weeks, paintings that should have been drying on easels or stored with her other completed works. The absence of these specific pieces suggested that someone had removed them, possibly because they contained evidence of Emily's stalker that could have led to identification. 15 months had passed since Emily Carter's disappearance, when an unexpected development breathed new life into the investigation that had consumed Sarah's existence and haunted Detective Rodriguez's professional conscience. The breakthrough came not from police work or private investigation, but from a severe winter storm that would inadvertently expose the truth that had been literally buried beneath Emily's feet. The storm system, originating in the Gulf of Alaska, brought unprecedented snowfall and freezing temperatures to the Oregon Cascades. The weight of accumulated snow and ice caused structural damage to many older buildings in the region, including Emily's cabin. The foundation, built in the 1960s using methods that were adequate for the era but insufficient for extreme weather conditions, began showing signs of significant stress and potential collapse. Sarah had been visiting the cabin monthly since Emily's disappearance, maintaining the property, partly as a memorial to her sister and partly from a stubborn hope that Emily might somehow return. During one such visit in February, she noticed that the living room floor near the fireplace had developed a noticeable sag, and several floorboards had warped beyond repair. Concerned about the cabin's structural integrity and her own safety during visits, she decided to hire contractors to assess and repair the damage. The renovation decision was also motivated by Sarah's evolving relationship with grief and memory. Her therapist had suggested that taking positive action regarding Emily's property might help her process her loss while maintaining connection to her sister's memory. The idea of restoring the cabin to the condition Emily would have wanted felt like a way to honor her sister's love for the property and their grandmother's legacy. Construction worker Jake Morrison, recommended by several Cedar Ridge residents for his skill with older structures, began the repair project on a crisp March morning. Morrison had lived in the area his entire life, working on hundreds of cabins and rural homes throughout the region. His experience with buildings from the 1960s made him the logical choice for repairs that needed to respect the cabin's original character while meeting modern safety standards. Morrison's assessment revealed that the foundation damage was more extensive than initially apparent. The freezing and thawing cycles had shifted several support beams, requiring replacement of not just the damaged floorboards, but also the underlying structural elements. The work would involve removing large sections of flooring near the fireplace, exactly the area where Emily had filmed her final terrifying recording. On the third day of construction, Morrison was installing new support beams when his crowbar struck something metallic beneath the floorboards. The sound was distinctive, not the hollow thud of hitting a nail or pipe, but the sharp clink of metal against metal. Curious and experienced enough to know that unexpected objects under floors often had significance, Morrison carefully pried up additional boards to investigate. His discovery would finally provide answers to questions that had tormented the Carter family for over a year and would expose a betrayal that shocked the entire community. Hidden in a carefully constructed compartment was Emily's missing GoPro camera, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic bags to protect it from moisture. Alongside the camera was a small notebook filled with Emily's distinctive handwriting, documenting observations and fears that painted a much darker picture of her final weeks than anyone had imagined. Sarah's hands shook uncontrollably as she held the camera for the first time since Emily's disappearance. The device felt heavy with the weight of secrets and potential answers. The accompanying notebook was water-stained but readable, its pages filled with dates, times, and detailed descriptions of suspicious activities that Emily had been too frightened to report through official channels. The notebook revealed the methodical nature of Emily's terror and her desperate attempts to document evidence that might protect her or identify her tormentor if something happened to her. Entries described her growing awareness that someone was entering her cabin during her absence, moving objects just enough to let her know they had been there. She had started marking the positions of items with tiny pencil dots, confirming her suspicions when things were consistently moved and returned. Emily's final notebook entry, dated just hours before she vanished, was barely legible due to her obvious emotional distress. "He's been inside the house. I can smell cigarette smoke in the morning, but I don't smoke. Things are moved just slightly. My coffee mug turned a different direction, books rearranged on the shelf, my paintings touched with fingers that aren't mine. He knows I know he's been here. He wants me to be afraid. He wants me to know I can't escape him. I'm hiding the camera because I think tonight he's going to stop playing games." Detective Rodriguez responded to Sarah's frantic phone call within 2 hours, immediately securing both items as evidence and establishing a crime scene perimeter around the cabin. The discovery transformed Emily's case from a presumed accident or voluntary disappearance into an active homicide investigation, bringing resources and expertise that had been previously unavailable. The camera's memory card contained over 40 hours of recordings, including footage Emily had deliberately hidden from her regular documentation routine. These secret recordings revealed a much darker and more terrifying picture of her final weeks than anyone had imagined possible. Emily had been systematically stalked, terrorized, and psychologically tortured by someone who had intimate knowledge of her daily routines and access to her most private spaces. The hidden footage showed Emily setting up motion-activated recording sessions throughout her cabin, trying to capture evidence of her stalker's intrusions. The recordings captured audio of someone moving through her house while she was away, opening drawers, examining her belongings, and even lying on her bed. The violation was comprehensive and deliberate, designed to maximize Emily's psychological distress while leaving minimal physical evidence. In one chilling sequence, filmed through a window using the camera's night vision capabilities, a figure could be seen moving around the cabin's exterior at 3 a.m. The person was careful to stay in shadows and avoid direct views of their face, but their familiarity with the property's layout was obvious. They knew exactly where to step, to avoid the creaky boards on the front porch, which bushes provided cover from neighboring properties, and how to approach the cabin without triggering motion sensor lights Emily had installed. The enhanced audio analysis from Emily's final recording provided the breakthrough that investigators desperately needed. Voice analysis specialists from the Oregon State Police Crime Laboratory worked for 3 weeks to clean up the whispered words captured on Emily's camera, using sophisticated software to remove background noise, enhance frequency ranges, and isolate individual vocal characteristics. The process was painstaking and technically complex, requiring multiple iterations and cross-verification to ensure accuracy. When the specialists finally produced clear audio samples, Detective Rodriguez felt her blood run cold as she recognized the voice, the whispered words, "Emily, I know you're here. We need to finish what we started," belonged to someone she knew professionally, someone who had been involved in the investigation from its earliest moments. The voice belonged to Deputy Marcus Thompson, the first responder to Emily's disappearance and a 20-year veteran of the Jackson County Sheriff's Department. The revelation that a trusted law enforcement officer was responsible for Emily's disappearance sent immediate shockwaves through the department and the broader Cedar Ridge community. Sheriff Patricia Wells, who had known Thompson personally for over 15 years, initially refused to believe the evidence. Thompson had been a model officer throughout his career, receiving commendations for bravery, community service, and professional excellence. He had coached youth baseball, volunteered at community events, and maintained a spotless record with internal affairs. The psychological impact on Thompson's colleagues was devastating. Detective Rodriguez, who had worked alongside Thompson on numerous cases, struggled to reconcile the helpful colleague she knew with the predator revealed by the evidence. "It's like discovering that someone you trusted with your life, someone you considered family, had been wearing a mask the entire time," she later explained to investigators from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Sheriff Wells immediately placed Thompson on administrative leave, pending a complete investigation, and requested assistance from both the FBI and the Oregon State Police to ensure the integrity of the evidence review. The decision to involve outside agencies was crucial, given that Thompson's position within the department had given him access to all evidence, witness statements, and investigative theories throughout the case. Further analysis of Emily's GoPro footage revealed the sophisticated nature of Thompson's stalking behavior. Using enhanced video technology and frame-by-frame analysis, investigators identified Thompson's patrol vehicle, parked in various concealed locations around Emily's property during his off-duty hours. The positioning of his vehicle demonstrated detailed knowledge of the terrain and sightlines, suggesting he had conducted extensive reconnaissance before beginning his systematic harassment. Phone records subpoenaed from Thompson's personal and work devices revealed a disturbing pattern of surveillance and obsession. He had made numerous calls to numbers that traced back to disposable phones later found in his personal vehicle. These phones contained photographs of Emily taken without her knowledge, along with detailed notes about her daily routines, her emotional vulnerabilities, and his escalating fantasies about their relationship. Most damning was GPS data from Thompson's patrol car that placed him at or near Emily's cabin, during times when he had reported being on routine patrol in other areas of the county. The data showed that he had visited Emily's property at least 16 times in the 2 months before her disappearance, always during shifts when he was supposed to be patrolling different sectors of his assigned territory. Emily's notebook provided additional evidence of Thompson's escalating behavior and her growing awareness of the threat he represented. Her entries described a patrol deputy who had initially seemed protective and professional, stopping by occasionally during his rounds to check on her welfare as a woman living alone in a remote location. Thompson had presented these visits as routine community policing, part of the department's commitment to protecting vulnerable residents. However, Emily's detailed observations revealed how Thompson's visits became increasingly invasive and inappropriate over time. He began arriving unannounced, letting himself into the cabin when she wasn't home, and asking personal questions about her divorce, her emotional state, and her reasons for choosing such an isolated lifestyle. Emily's notebook entries showed her growing discomfort with Thompson's behavior, though she initially attributed her unease to her own emotional vulnerability following her divorce. "At first, I thought Deputy Thompson was just being kind," Emily had written. "He said he wanted to make sure I felt safe out here, that the department looked out for people like me. But his questions feel too personal now. He knows things about my daily routine that I never told him. He comments on my paintings, books I'm reading, even what I had for breakfast. How does he know these things unless he's been in my house when I'm not here?" The investigation revealed that Thompson had been targeting vulnerable women for years, using his law enforcement position to gain access and credibility while avoiding suspicion. Emily wasn't his first victim, though she was the first to document his stalking behavior so thoroughly, and the first whose case had received extensive investigation. The documentation Emily had created, driven by her background in graphic design and her methodical personality, provided evidence that previous victims had been unable to gather. If this case has already gripped you, please leave a like. This helps the channel bring more stories like these and helps Emily Carter's story reach more people. 3 other women in Jackson County had filed complaints over the previous 5 years about a deputy who made them feel uncomfortable, but these reports were dismissed as misunderstandings or personality conflicts by supervisors who trusted Thompson's reputation and explanations. The complainants were all women who fit a specific profile: recently divorced or widowed, living alone, emotionally vulnerable, and unlikely to be believed if they reported inappropriate behavior by a respected law enforcement officer. Jennifer Martinez, a 28-year-old teacher who had filed a complaint 2 years before Emily's disappearance, described interactions with Thompson that followed an identical pattern to his harassment of Emily. After her husband was killed in a motorcycle accident, Thompson began appearing at her home frequently, ostensibly to check on her welfare. His visits became increasingly personal and intrusive, including comments about her appearance, questions about her dating life, and suggestions that she needed male protection. He would show up at my house at odd hours, claiming he was responding to reports of suspicious activity in the neighborhood, Martinez recalled. But there were never any reports. He would walk through my house, checking windows and doors, but always lingering in my bedroom or bathroom longer than necessary. He made comments about my clothes, about how lonely I must be, about how dangerous it was for a woman to live alone. I felt violated every time he left. Thompson's psychological profile, compiled by FBI behavioral analysts who specialized in law enforcement officers who committed crimes, painted a picture of a man who used his authority and community standing to gain access to victims while using his professional knowledge to avoid detection. The profile identified him as a power-assertive offender who derived satisfaction from the control and fear he could instill in victims through his position of authority. The analysis revealed that Thompson specifically targeted women who were isolated, emotionally vulnerable, or unlikely to be believed if they reported his behavior. Emily's situation, recently divorced, living alone in a remote location, new to the community, and already dismissed by law enforcement when she reported feeling unsafe, made her an ideal target for his escalating predatory behavior. Dr. Sarah Chen, the FBI's leading expert on law enforcement officers who commit crimes, explained Thompson's methodology. Officers like Thompson are particularly dangerous because they understand how investigations work, how evidence is collected, and how to manipulate the system to avoid suspicion. They know that their word carries more weight than a victim's, especially when the victim is a woman reporting vague feelings of being watched or followed. Thompson used his badge as both a weapon and a shield. Armed with overwhelming evidence from Emily's recordings and the additional investigation that followed, law enforcement prepared to arrest Deputy Marcus Thompson. However, the confrontation would not unfold as investigators had planned. Thompson, whose 20 years of police experience had taught him to recognize when an investigation was closing in on a suspect, had been carefully monitoring the case's progress and preparing for this moment. The investigation into Thompson had been conducted with maximum secrecy to prevent him from learning about the evidence against him. Detective Rodriguez had coordinated with FBI agents and Oregon State Police investigators to ensure that only personnel outside the Jackson County Sheriff's Department had access to the most damning evidence. However, Thompson's position within the department and his relationships with other officers provided him with enough information to sense the changing atmosphere. On the morning of the planned arrest, Thompson failed to report for his scheduled shift, something virtually unprecedented in his 20-year career. His supervisor, Sergeant Maria Santos, initially assumed Thompson was ill or dealing with a family emergency. However, when repeated attempts to reach him by phone and radio failed, Santos began to worry that something more serious might be occurring. Thompson's wife, Helen, contacted the department at 11:30 a.m. to report that her husband had left their home before dawn, claiming he was going fishing at Crater Lake, a popular destination in the Cascade Mountains, several hours from their home. Helen explained that Marcus had seemed agitated and distracted for several days, refusing to discuss what was bothering him and spending hours in his garage workshop, supposedly organizing fishing equipment. Marcus loves to fish, but he never goes alone, and he always tells me exactly where he's going and when he'll be back, Helen told Sergeant Santos. This morning was different. He was packed and gone before I woke up, and he left only a note saying he needed to clear his head. Something's wrong, but I don't know what. Detective Rodriguez immediately recognized that Thompson was likely attempting to flee, or worse, planning to destroy evidence that could implicate him further. Her experience with fugitive investigations told her that Thompson's law enforcement background would make him far more dangerous and difficult to apprehend than typical suspects. He understood police procedures, radio communications, and tactical operations, giving him significant advantages in evading capture. Taebolo, be on the lookout alert, was immediately issued for Thompson and his personal vehicle, a dark green Ford F-150 pickup truck that had appeared in several of Emily's surveillance recordings. The alert was distributed to law enforcement agencies across Oregon, Northern California, and Washington state, with special emphasis on areas known for outdoor recreation where Thompson might attempt to hide. The FBI activated its fugitive task force, bringing specialized resources including helicopter surveillance, electronic tracking capabilities, and behavioral analysts who could predict Thompson's likely actions based on his psychological profile. The task force coordinator, Special Agent Michael Foster, had extensive experience tracking fugitive law enforcement officers and understood the unique challenges they presented. "Cops who run know how we think, how we operate, and how we'll try to find them," Agent Foster explained to the search team. "Thompson will avoid his usual patterns, stay away from places he's known to frequent, and try to use his police knowledge against us. But that same knowledge also limits his options. He knows we'll be watching his financial accounts, monitoring his communications, and tracking his associates." The manhunt intensified when Thompson's truck was discovered abandoned at a trailhead leading into the Three Sisters Wilderness area, a vast expanse of rugged terrain covering over 280,000 acres of pristine wilderness. The location was strategically chosen. The wilderness area contained thousands of potential hiding places, limited access points for search teams, and terrain that could challenge even experienced outdoors professionals. Search teams examining Thompson's abandoned vehicle made several disturbing discoveries that confirmed the worst fears about Emily's fate. Hidden beneath the truck's spare tire was a duffel bag containing Emily's jewelry, including her grandmother's antique turquoise ring that Sarah had specifically mentioned during the original missing person interviews. The ring was a family heirloom that Emily never removed, making its presence in Thompson's possession clear evidence of her murder. Also in the bag were photographs of Emily taken without her knowledge over a period of several months. The images showed her daily routines in disturbing detail. Emily painting at her easel, working in her garden, cooking breakfast, and even sleeping. The photographs were organized chronologically and annotated with notes about Emily's schedule, emotional state, and vulnerabilities, revealing the extent of Thompson's obsession and premeditation. Most chilling was a detailed journal found in Thompson's truck that documented his fantasies about Emily and other women he had targeted. The entries, written in Thompson's distinctive handwriting and spanning several years, revealed a progression from admiration to possession to violence. The journal contained detailed plans for isolating victims, breaking down their psychological defenses, and ultimately controlling every aspect of their lives. The final journal entry, dated the day Emily disappeared, contained a chilling blueprint for what Thompson described as completing the relationship with Emily. The entry detailed his plans for confronting Emily in her cabin, his preparations for disposing of evidence, and his strategies for deflecting suspicion during the inevitable investigation that would follow. She finally understands that she belongs to me, Thompson had written. The fear in her eyes when she sees me now is perfect. She knows she can't escape, can't hide from me, can't get help from anyone. Tonight I'll show her what happens to women who try to run from their protectors. Tonight, she'll learn that fighting me only makes things more painful for her. The search for Marcus Thompson in the Three Sisters wilderness became one of the largest and most complex manhunts in Oregon's history, involving over 200 law enforcement personnel from multiple agencies. The rugged terrain, covering more than 280,000 acres of pristine wilderness, provided countless hiding places for someone with Thompson's outdoor skills and intimate knowledge of law enforcement tracking methods. The wilderness area itself presented extraordinary challenges for the search teams. Elevations ranged from 3,000 feet in the valleys to over 10,000 feet at the peaks of the Three Sisters Mountains. The terrain included dense old-growth forests, alpine meadows, volcanic rock formations, glacial valleys, and dozens of lakes and streams that could complicate search patterns and communication systems. FBI Tactical Coordinator Special Agent Michael Foster established a command post at the Sisters Ranger Station, coordinating resources that included helicopter surveillance with thermal imaging equipment, specially trained tracking dogs, elite search and rescue teams, and technology specialists using satellite imagery and GPS tracking systems. The scale of the operation reflected both the seriousness of Thompson's crimes and the unique challenges posed by a fugitive with law enforcement training. Thompson's familiarity with the wilderness gave him significant advantages over his pursuers. As a deputy sheriff, he had participated in numerous search and rescue operations in the same area over his 20-year career, learning the locations of hidden caves, abandoned cabins, natural shelters, and water sources that could sustain a fugitive indefinitely. His military background as a Marine Corps reconnaissance specialist further enhanced his ability to survive and evade capture in challenging terrain. The manhunt's complexity was increased by Thompson's understanding of law enforcement procedures and technology. He knew how search patterns were organized, how tracking dogs operated, how helicopter surveillance worked, and how communication systems could be monitored. This knowledge allowed him to stay ahead of search teams by anticipating their movements and avoiding areas where he might be trapped. Search teams discovered evidence of Thompson's presence throughout the wilderness area. During the first week of operations, makeshift campsites, carefully concealed and quickly abandoned, showed his movement patterns and survival strategies. He was traveling light but efficiently, using military-style evasion techniques and natural shelters rather than conventional camping equipment that might be spotted by aerial surveillance. The psychological pressure of being hunted began to affect Thompson's decision-making as the search entered its second week. Radio intercepts suggested he was monitoring law enforcement communications using a police scanner, becoming increasingly desperate as search teams eliminated potential escape routes. His movements became more erratic and risky, suggesting that the stress of constant pursuit was overriding his tactical training. On the fifth day of the manhunt, hikers discovered Thompson's most substantial campsite in a remote canyon near South Sister Peak. The location was strategically chosen for its natural defensibility and water access, but also revealed Thompson's deteriorating mental state. The site showed signs of prolonged occupation, including multiple fire rings, food storage systems, and what appeared to be a primitive shelter constructed from natural materials. Most significantly, investigators found additional evidence of Thompson's crimes hidden in a waterproof container buried near the campsite. The buried evidence included more photographs of Emily Carter, some taken just hours before her disappearance, showing her in a state of obvious distress and terror. The images provided a horrifying window into Emily's final hours and Thompson's complete lack of remorse for his actions. The container also held personal items from other potential victims that expanded the scope of Thompson's crimes, far beyond what investigators had previously suspected. Jewelry, driver's licenses, and identification cards from women across 3 states indicated that Thompson's predatory behavior had continued throughout his law enforcement career, with Emily Carter representing only the most recent and thoroughly documented case. Dr. Lisa Williams, a forensic psychologist specializing in serial predators, analyzed the evidence found at Thompson's campsite to develop a behavioral profile that could predict his next moves. Thompson is experiencing what we call predator collapse. Dr. Williams explained to the search team coordinators. His carefully constructed facade has been destroyed, his hunting ground has been exposed, and he's facing inevitable capture. This makes him extremely dangerous, as he has nothing left to lose. Sarah Carter Martinez joined the search effort, despite official discouragement from law enforcement personnel who worried about her safety and emotional well-being. Her presence in the wilderness, searching for the man who had killed her sister, provided both motivation for the search teams and a sense of personal closure for herself. Sarah felt compelled to be present when Thompson was captured, to represent Emily during the final confrontation with her killer. "I needed to be there," Sarah explained to FBI agents who tried to convince her to return to Portland. Emily died alone and afraid because of this monster. She spent her last weeks in terror, calling for help that never came, documenting evidence that took months to discover. "The least I could do was be part of bringing him to justice. I owed that to my sister." Local residents throughout the Three Sisters region reported suspicious sightings and provided assistance to search teams, demonstrating the community's determination to capture Thompson. Many of these residents had known Thompson professionally and felt personally betrayed by his crimes. Their intimate knowledge of the wilderness and willingness to serve as guides for search teams proved invaluable in covering the vast search area efficiently. Wildlife cameras placed throughout the search area by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife captured blurry images of a figure moving through the forest at night. The images, enhanced by FBI technical specialists, showed someone matching Thompson's physical description traveling on foot through dense forest, always staying ahead of search teams, but clearly showing signs of exhaustion and desperation. The manhunt took an ominous turn when search teams discovered evidence that Thompson was becoming increasingly unstable and potentially suicidal. Abandoned campsites contained disturbing writings carved into trees and rocks, including messages directed at Emily Carter's family and threats against law enforcement personnel pursuing him. The writings revealed a man whose grip on reality was deteriorating under the pressure of inevitable capture. Thompson's tactical situation continued to deteriorate as search teams systematically eliminated potential escape routes and hiding places. The wilderness area, while vast, had limited access points that could be monitored and controlled. Thompson's options were shrinking daily, forcing him into increasingly desperate decisions that made his capture more likely but also more dangerous for everyone involved. On the 8th day of the manhunt, thermal imaging equipment aboard an FBI helicopter detected a heat signature in a complex cave system near Obsidian Creek, approximately 15 miles from where Thompson had abandoned his vehicle. The location represented both a tactical nightmare and a strategic endgame for the fugitive who had terrorized Emily Carter and manipulated the investigation into her disappearance. The cave system was part of an ancient lava flow that had created a network of tunnels and chambers extending deep into the mountainside. Geological surveys indicated that the caves had multiple entrances and exits, some of which were barely large enough for a person to crawl through. The complexity of the system made it an ideal hiding place for someone with Thompson's military training, but it also created the potential for a dangerous standoff. FBI tactical teams, supported by specialized cave rescue experts from the Pacific Northwest, surrounded the known entrances to the cave system before dawn on the 9th day of the manhunt. The operation required careful coordination to prevent Thompson from escaping through unmapped passages, while also ensuring the safety of the tactical teams who would need to enter the confined spaces of the cave system if negotiations failed. The initial contact with Thompson came through loudspeakers positioned at the main cave entrance, with FBI negotiators attempting to establish communication and convince him to surrender peacefully. The response that echoed from within the cave system was not the voice of the confident deputy sheriff who had fooled his colleagues for 20 years, but rather the desperate rambling of a man whose carefully constructed public persona had finally collapsed completely. "She loved me," Thompson shouted from somewhere deep within the caves, his voice distorted by echoes and tinged with exhaustion and desperation. "Emily needed protection, and I was the only one who could give her what she needed. She was broken after her divorce, vulnerable, and I was trying to help her. Everything got out of control. She wasn't supposed to be afraid of me. I never wanted her to be afraid." Their statements, recorded by FBI negotiators and later analyzed by behavioral specialists, revealed Thompson's complete inability to acknowledge the reality of his crimes. His delusions about his relationship with Emily persisted even in the face of overwhelming evidence of his predatory behavior. The psychological profile suggested that Thompson genuinely believed he had been protecting Emily rather than terrorizing her. FBI negotiator Special Agent Rebecca Martinez, who had successfully resolved dozens of similar standoffs, attempted to establish a dialogue that might lead to peaceful surrender. Her approach focused on acknowledging Thompson's emotional state, while gradually introducing reality-based elements that might break through his delusional thinking. "Marcus, I understand that you cared about Emily," Agent Martinez called into the cave, "but right now, we need to focus on ending this situation safely. Emily's family wants answers about what happened to her. You're the only person who can provide those answers. Help us understand what occurred, and we can work together to resolve this peacefully." Thompson's responses became increasingly incoherent as the standoff continued, alternating between protestations of innocence and detailed descriptions of his surveillance activities. He spoke about watching Emily through her windows, about entering her cabin to check on her safety, and about his growing frustration with her failure to appreciate his protection. The recordings provided additional evidence for prosecutors while revealing the depth of Thompson's psychological disturbance. The standoff continued for 6 hours as negotiators attempted to convince Thompson to surrender, while tactical teams prepared for the possibility that force might be necessary. Family members of Thompson's victims, including Sarah Carter Martinez, watched from a designated area several hundred yards from the cave system, experiencing a mixture of anticipation, fear, and hope that this ordeal might finally reach resolution. Sarah later described the experience as surreal and cathartic, finally seeing the monster who destroyed our family being held accountable for his crimes, but also terrifying because we knew he was capable of violence and might never face trial if he chose suicide over capture. The emotional complexity of the situation affected everyone present, from seasoned FBI agents to local law enforcement officers who had worked alongside Thompson for years. Thompson's surrender came not through successful negotiation, but through physical collapse, brought on by dehydration, exhaustion, and the psychological stress of his situation. When tactical teams finally entered the cave system using specialized equipment and protective gear, they found Thompson unconscious near a small underground stream, his body pushed beyond its limits by days of flight and the mental pressure of inevitable capture. The arrest scene revealed additional evidence of Thompson's crimes and his deteriorating mental state during the manhunt. His backpack contained detailed maps marking the locations where he had buried evidence from multiple victims across 3 states. A handheld GPS device showed waypoints corresponding to these burial sites, creating a horrifying trail of predatory behavior stretching back over 15 years of his law enforcement career. Among Thompson's personal effects was Emily Carter's bracelet, a simple silver chain with a small heart charm that Sarah had given her sister for her birthday the year before her disappearance. Sarah had specifically mentioned the bracelet during the original missing person investigation, describing it as something Emily never removed. Finding it in Thompson's possession provided final confirmation of his role in Emily's murder and the extent of his obsession with keeping trophies from his victims. Thompson was medically stabilized by emergency medical technicians before being transported under maximum security to the Jackson County Jail, where he was formally charged with Emily Carter's murder, as well as multiple counts of stalking, breaking and entering, evidence tampering, and violations of civil rights under color of law. Federal charges related to his other victims across state lines would follow, as investigators processed the evidence discovered during his capture. The arrest brought a sense of closure to the Cedar Ridge community and Emily Carter's family, but also raised troubling questions about how Thompson had been able to operate as a predator for so many years while maintaining his reputation as a respected law enforcement officer. The case would ultimately lead to significant reforms in police accountability and oversight procedures designed to prevent similar tragedies. The trial of Marcus Thompson began 18 months after Emily Carter's disappearance, bringing together evidence that painted a comprehensive and horrifying picture of predatory behavior that had spanned nearly 2 decades of his law enforcement career. The Jackson County Courthouse, normally a quiet venue for routine legal proceedings, became the focal point for a case that had captured national attention and raised fundamental questions about police accountability and victim protection. Prosecutors Susan Walsh and David Chen, both experienced in complex criminal cases, presented Emily's GoPro recordings as the centerpiece of their case against Thompson. The footage was so emotionally powerful and legally compelling that it dominated the courtroom proceedings, allowing the jury to hear Emily's own words describing her terror and see the evidence she had courageously documented, despite knowing the extreme personal risk. The presentation of Emily's recordings required careful legal and psychological preparation. The judge, recognizing the emotional impact of the evidence, allowed breaks during the viewing and provided counseling resources for jury members who might be traumatized by witnessing Emily's fear and desperation. Several jurors were visibly shaken during the presentation, with some requiring medical attention due to the emotional stress of witnessing a victim's final recorded words. Emily's voice, speaking directly from the recordings made in her final weeks, became the prosecution's most compelling witness. Her detailed descriptions of Thompson's stalking behavior, her growing fear and isolation, and her desperate attempts to document evidence that might identify her tormentor, created an unbreakable chain of evidence, linking Thompson directly to her terrorization and eventual murder. She was essentially testifying from the grave, prosecutor Susan Walsh explained, during a press conference following the verdict. Emily's courage in continuing to document the evidence, even when she knew she was in mortal danger, provided us with testimony that no living witness could match. Her own voice condemned her killer and ensured that justice would be served. Thompson's defense team, led by experienced criminal attorney Michael Rodriguez, faced an almost impossible task in challenging the overwhelming evidence against their client. They attempted to portray Thompson as a man driven to temporary insanity by personal problems, job stress, and what they described as an inappropriate emotional attachment to a vulnerable woman who had misinterpreted his professional concern as harassment. The defense strategy centered on arguing that Emily's death was unplanned, the result of a confrontation that escalated beyond Thompson's control rather than a premeditated murder. They suggested that Thompson's law enforcement background had made him overly protective of Emily, leading to inappropriate behavior that tragically resulted in an accidental death during an argument. However, the extensive evidence of premeditation discovered during the investigation demolished this defense strategy before it could gain any credibility with the jury. Thompson's detailed surveillance of Emily, his systematic psychological terrorism, his careful documentation of other victims, and his methodical attempts to cover up his crimes demonstrated clear intent and planning that contradicted any claim of temporary insanity or accidental death. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by testimony from other women who had been targeted by Thompson but survived to tell their stories. Jennifer Martinez, the teacher who had filed a complaint about Thompson 2 years before Emily's disappearance, provided devastating testimony about Thompson's identical pattern of behavior with previous victims. He used his badge as a weapon, Martinez testified, her voice strong despite the obvious emotional difficulty of recounting her experiences. He would show up at my house claiming to be investigating reports of suspicious activity, but there were never any reports. He knew I was vulnerable after my husband's death, and he exploited that vulnerability. He made me feel like I was going crazy, like I was paranoid and delusional for being afraid of someone who was supposed to protect me. 2 other victims provided similar testimony, establishing a clear pattern of predatory behavior that spanned Thompson's entire law enforcement career. Their accounts revealed Thompson's sophisticated understanding of how to select victims who were unlikely to be believed, how to use his official position to gain access and credibility, and how to manipulate the system to avoid accountability for his actions. During the trial, investigators revealed the full scope of Thompson's crimes through evidence discovered at his various hiding places during the manhunt. The evidence linked him to 17 unsolved cases of missing or murdered women across Oregon, Washington, and Northern California spanning 15 years. While Emily Carter's case would be the only murder charge that could be conclusively proven, the scope of Thompson's predatory behavior was far broader and more systematic than anyone had initially suspected. Dr. Sarah Chen, the FBI's behavioral analyst who had profiled Thompson during the investigation, testified about the psychological factors that drove his crimes and enabled him to maintain his public facade for so many years. Her testimony helped the jury understand how Thompson had been able to compartmentalize his criminal behavior while maintaining his reputation as a respected law enforcement officer. Thompson represents a particularly dangerous type of predator, Dr. Chen explained to the jury. He used his position of trust and authority not just to access victims, but to manipulate the entire system that should have protected them. His victims were afraid to report his behavior because he was the person they were supposed to report to. When they did try to get help, his colleagues dismissed their concerns because Thompson was a respected officer with an exemplary record. Thompson himself never testified in his own defense, maintaining the silence he had adopted since his capture in the wilderness. His refusal to provide information about other victims or explain his motives left families with unanswered questions about their own missing loved ones and denied him any possibility of mitigating factors during sentencing. His silence was interpreted by many observers as his final act of cruelty toward the families he had already damaged so profoundly. Sarah Carter Martinez described Thompson's refusal to speak as one last way to torture the families of his victims, keeping us wondering about details we'll never know, questions that will haunt us forever. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including first-degree murder in Emily's death, multiple counts of stalking and harassment, breaking and entering, evidence tampering, and federal civil rights violations. The speed of the deliberation reflected both the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the jury's revulsion at Thompson's systematic abuse of his authority. Judge Margaret Harrison sentenced Thompson to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Emily's murder, plus additional consecutive sentences, totaling another 60 years for his other crimes. The sentence ensured that Thompson would never again be free to harm women or abuse the public trust he had so thoroughly violated. In pronouncing the sentence, Judge Harrison noted that Thompson had violated the most sacred trust between law enforcement and the community, using his badge not to protect and serve, but to hunt and kill innocent women. The betrayal of public trust represented by these crimes demands the most severe punishment available under the law. Emily's story, preserved in her own voice through the GoPro recordings, ensured that her killer's crimes would not be forgotten and that her death would serve to protect other potential victims. Her footage became a powerful tool for law enforcement training programs across the country, helping officers recognize the warning signs of predatory behavior among their colleagues and understand the importance of taking victim reports seriously. The case prompted significant reforms in police accountability and oversight procedures. The Emily Carter Act, passed by the Oregon legislature, requires mandatory reporting of complaints against law enforcement officers, independent investigation of officer misconduct allegations, and regular psychological evaluations for officers in positions of trust. Similar legislation was introduced in several other states, extending Emily's protective legacy beyond Oregon's borders. Sarah Carter Martinez established the Emily Carter Foundation, with support from victim advocacy groups and law enforcement reform organizations. The foundation provides support services for families of missing persons, advocates for improved police accountability measures, and funds training programs designed to help law enforcement recognize and respond appropriately to stalking and domestic violence cases. The foundation's work ensures that Emily's legacy extends far beyond her tragic death, helping other families navigate the nightmare of having a loved one disappear and fighting to prevent future tragedies. Sarah has traveled across the country, speaking to police departments, community groups, and legislative bodies about the importance of taking victim reports seriously and maintaining rigorous oversight of law enforcement officers. The cabin where Emily lived and died has been demolished, but the 20 acres remain in the Carter family as a memorial to Emily's memory and her grandmother's legacy. Sarah has planted a memorial garden there, filled with wildflowers that bloom each spring in brilliant displays of color that seem to celebrate life in the face of tragedy. The garden has become an informal pilgrimage site for people touched by Emily's story. Visitors often leave small tokens at the memorial garden, painted rocks with inspiring messages, handwritten notes expressing sympathy and support, flowers picked from the surrounding forest, and small works of art inspired by Emily's creative spirit. The informal shrine creates a sense of community among people who never met Emily, but were moved by her courage and determination to document the truth, even in the face of mortal danger. Emily Carter's final recording, made in desperate fear as her killer approached her cabin, ended with words that became prophetic and inspirational. "If something happens to me, don't let them forget. Don't let them give up. Make sure someone knows what really happened here." Her family, the community of Cedar Ridge, and law enforcement agencies across the country have honored that request, ensuring that Emily's story continues to inspire changes in how missing persons cases are investigated and how law enforcement officers are held accountable for their actions. The case remains a stark reminder that predators often hide behind respected facades, using positions of trust and authority to access victims and avoid detection. Emily Carter's extraordinary courage in documenting her final weeks, despite knowing the extreme personal risk, provided the evidence needed to expose a killer who might otherwise have continued preying on vulnerable women indefinitely. Her voice, preserved in those chilling recordings, became the instrument of justice she desperately hoped it would be. Emily's story demonstrates that even in the darkest circumstances, truth has the power to emerge, and that victims can speak from beyond the grave to ensure that their killers face accountability for their crimes. The Emily Carter case has become a textbook example of how technology can preserve victim testimony, how systematic documentation can overcome institutional bias, and how the courage of one person can expose corruption and predatory behavior that might otherwise remain hidden. Emily's legacy lives on in the lives saved by reforms inspired by her case and in the families helped by the foundation created in her memory. Her final message to the world, documented in her own voice and preserved forever in digital form, continues to inspire law enforcement officers, victim advocates, and ordinary citizens to never give up in the search for truth and justice. Emily Carter's name has become synonymous with courage, persistence, and the power of victims to speak truth to power, even in the face of ultimate sacrifice. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Emily Carter's story. We'll see you in the next video.